On Christmas Eve, he said 3 words that changed everything. "My ex is coming." I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a small, precise thing, the kind you practice in a mirror when you need to hold a face for hours. The tree lights painted the dining room in soft gold. The table was set with our good china. The scent of roasted lamb and orange-glazed carrots filled the house like a promise. Marcus stood by the doorway in his wool coat, looking as if he had merely announced the weather. Plates in my hands, I let the smile sit where it would do the most damage. You don't understand that smile unless you've rehearsed the moment. You don't understand it unless you've spent months turning your terror into a plan, until livid, raw emotion is tempered into an instrument. By then, of course, the instrument is you. That night, on the surface, a perfect holiday, in the center of a life that had once promised to be steady, everything I had built felt thin as paper. I had lost things that could not be returned. Quiet weekends when we used to linger in bed, the small, private jokes spelled out on Post-its around the house, the child we had wanted desperately and briefly carried inside me, and then lost in an empty hospital room. Grief had become the background hum of my days, a presence in every closet and drawer. When Marcus said my ex is coming, he thought he was announcing a polite social obligation. He had no idea how precise I had become. It began, in the way these things often begin, on a night that should have been ordinary and warm. October 15th, our 7th anniversary, was supposed to be a marker, a small ritual we repeat to remind ourselves we were the kind of couple who could last. I had laid out candles. I had made his favorite appetizer, because even after 7 years, he still claimed mine was the only dish that tasted right. We had that particular easy laughter that comes from shared history and too much wine. I remember the gentle tick of the oven, the way the steam fogged the window, the soft thud of the dog curled at our feet. His phone buzzed on the counter, a quick, familiar light. He reached for it, smiled, and put it down. Later, a small vibration on the table kept me awake through the night. My phone, a message from a gallery asking about a commission, some business emails. But it wasn't until the next morning that the rhythm of our life cracked. I found the messages on the couch cushion while I was tidying up after breakfast. Marcus had gone into the garage. Luke and Emma were upstairs, building a fort. The cushion slipped, and a folded piece of paper tumbled out. An old-school receipt, a hotel key card, a crumpled slip of paper with shorthand numbers. He had a sloppy habit of stuffing things into couch gaps, little relics of an absent-minded life. I picked up the paper and, without thinking, typed the number into my phone as if confirming a dinner reservation. A message frosted my screen from VH. "You were amazing last night." There is a calculus to shock. At first, the brain refuses to accept. Those words slip out of a person who has misread something. You look for explanations, hoping for a mislabel, a case of mistaken identity. You tell yourself he will come home and your anger will be unreasonable, that you are the unstable one because of the miscarriage, because grief makes us see ghosts where none exist. I remember my first instinct was to laugh at myself for panicking. He walked in as I sat there with the receipt and the number and the impossible sentence. He kissed me, and it was enough to make me nauseous. I did not make accusations. I did not throw the receipt on the table and demand answers. Instead, I took the one thing you never expect to matter. I kept breathing, and I read every message. You learn quickly what a lifetime of small betrayals looks like on a screen. VH was a shorthand that became a code. What started as witty exchanges, "I'm thinking of you," turned into things that bore the heavy, unmistakable shape of intimacy. Photos with timestamps, a casual "I miss you" on a Tuesday at 3 in the morning, a little joke about remembering the way you hold my hand. The messages had a texture of private language. There was one photograph that felt like a slap, a dim image of 2 shadows behind a hotel window, a timestamp in the corner that said October 12, the night I had been in the hospital, having lost our baby. I sat down hard on the kitchen floor, the tile cold, the dog licking my foot like an alarm. For a moment, the scene was elemental, tile, light, the little stub of a receipt. The recognition was not the ending of a story. It was the opening of a different book. I felt the familiar, terrible fog of grief press in. My body had already been a battlefield, and under the grief, a new, instant clarity unfurled. Betrayal is a particular kind of arithmetic. Dates, photos, messages. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. That day, I did not call him into the kitchen and demand he explain. Instead, I put on eyeliner and went to the hospital to pick up my medical records. I sat in a waiting room that smelled faintly of sanitizer and magazines and looked at the pages like evidence. The dates lined up.
I could not respond in the raw way that first impulse demanded. My instincts had been trained by years in the design world. When something looked wrong, you didn't react with emotion. You gathered material. There it is, a cold, almost surgical sentence that sounds like betrayal of the body that is hurt. The truth is, gathering materials felt like trying to keep the world from tilting. I needed proof because proof would make the chaos a thing I could speak to. Without it, the grief was amorphous and could be dismissed as paranoia.
With it, the betrayal had shape and could be placed in the hands of the people who could do something: lawyers, investigators, the quiet machinery of accountability. I told no one for weeks. I watched Marcus the way you watch a painting you suspect is fake. I cleaned more than I ever had. I put our family photos in frames and erased fingerprints from glass so that if I had to show something to someone, it would look like a life intact. I created small rituals that made the house feel not like a crime scene, but like a home that could still function. Then began the part the movies never show, the steady, quiet work of proof. I set boundaries, not as moral lectures, but as slow, business-like statements. I collected screenshots of messages. I took note of discrepancies in credit card statements. I made copies of anything that might be used later. I do not tell you this to instruct. I tell you this because the way betrayal feels is like being in a storm and deciding whether you will stand in the wind or build a shelter. I built a shelter. I hired Sam a month after the anniversary. Sam was an ex-cop turned private investigator with hollowed-out cheeks and a habit of chewing on the ends of pens when he was thinking. I had met him in a coffee shop because he was cheap and because he had a way of answering questions with questions, which made him feel more like an ally than a mercenary. He asked what I wanted, and I said plainly, confirmation. He said he couldn't promise outcomes. He said he would look. Sam found things I had not imagined he'd find. He confirmed dates when Marcus's claims did not match reality. He found hotel bookings. He traced reservations and found a pattern of stays that put Marcus and Victoria in close proximity on nights that matter. He uncovered a public social media post of Victoria holding up a champagne glass, the caption reading something like, "She said yes." I stared at that image until my eyes blurred, not because of the champagne or the smile, but because in the comment thread, someone had written a casual, looking forward to Sunday dinner with the families, and pinned to that was a comment tagging Alex Ramos, a name I did not recognize. Alex Ramos. I say his name now with gentleness. He is a man who would not have known about any of this if not for my need to be seen. At the time, he was an unknown variable that became essential. Sam tracked Alex as best he could within the bounds of what was lawful. He found that Alex was a pediatric surgeon at a hospital near our town. He had family photographs. He had the kind of life that was built in small public proofs, volunteering on weekends, a steady partner who posted photos from graduation ceremonies. There was no indication Alex knew anything about the messages between Marcus and Victoria. He was, as far as my heart could measure, an honest man, someone who could be called naive in the most tragic way. Knowing another man's ignorance felt complicated. Part of me wanted only to inflict pain. Part of me wanted the truth to be revealed gently. Those were two separate impulses that pulled at opposite sides of the same rope. But as the weeks wore on, the idea of exposing a secret that involved an innocent third person felt less like cruelty and more like responsibility. If Alex was to marry someone who was living a duplicitous life, did he not deserve to know? If a therapist, Victoria, was engaged in boundary violations with one married man while counseling other people's families, did that not warrant scrutiny? I told Sam to get more. He came back with a detail that felt like a physical shove. Victoria was in fact a licensed family therapist. The ethical irony made my stomach drop to the floor. A therapist whose job was to hold families together had been threading her fingers into the private life of another woman's marriage. I cannot overstate how much that detail did strange things inside me. It added a professional dimension to the betrayal that put a responsibility on me, not to stage a spectacle, but to seek accountability. I scheduled a meeting with Vivian Porter, a divorce attorney a friend had recommended over coffee, and a whispered, "She's no nonsense." Vivian listened while I unrolled what I had: dates, messages, photographs, Sam's report. She did not flinch when I mentioned the hospital photograph. She asked about costs, about priorities, about whether I wanted custody battles or quiet negotiations. Her questions were clinical, like Sam's, and in that clinicality there was relief. "Your primary objective," she said finally, "is to protect yourself." Then she paused and added, "But you're not a victim without agency." It felt like being handed a map. She advised me to compile everything into a folder she could review.
She also mentioned, carefully, that we could consider filing an ethics complaint against Victoria if her client records or communication suggested a breach. She warned me of the unpredictability of legal outcomes. No guarantees, she said, but we will make it count. You have to understand how strange it is to have your pain reduced to a checklist. It feels like a betrayal of your humanity, and at the same time, it is the only way to function. I assembled the folder like a curator, setting up an exhibition of a life turned catastrophic. The photos were laid out, the messages printed. Sam's notes were typed and annotated. I typed a statement that read cleanly: dates of affair, corroborating evidence, impacts on family. It is grotesque how therapeutic paperwork can be, how it renders chaos into neat bullet points. There were small, private conversations to be had too. I reached out to Lauren slowly, like testing the water with a toe. She's my sister, fierce, practical, and quick to anger, and she did not need convincing. When I told her, her face moved through stages: shock, then quiet fury, then an odd maternal protectiveness that felt like a warm hand on my shoulder.
"We will do this smart," she said. "We will not put you in danger. We will hold you." James, Lauren's husband, offered his workshop as a place to talk away from phones. They became my unlikely war room. Lauren with a list of friends I could call for immediate help. James with a stack of legal pads and a calculator. I remember, during those weeks, the smallness of ordinary life pushing through. I made lunches for Luke and Emma. We went to soccer practice. I taught a client how to stage their living room for a magazine shoot. The mundanity of it was both balm and blade. It allowed me to practice a life while simultaneously planning its end. Marcus did not sense the amount of attention focused on him. He was still Marcus, charming, exceedingly good at deflection, prone to late meetings, explaining away receipts with a shrug. He had become so used to being forgiven on the basis of suggesting the right gift at the right time that I could have stood in the doorway and described his entire life like a character study, and he would have nodded and laughed. Between the quiet domesticity and the momentum of the folder, a moral question kept circling. What does it mean to expose a betrayal that implicates other people? To make this a story of shame instead of a pursuit of truth? I found myself thinking of the therapist's couch and remembering how often my own life had been built on compassion. I had been the person in our marriage who sat with people while they told me pieces of themselves. I had been, in 1,000 small ways, the keeper of other people's vulnerabilities. The decision to expose was not taken gleefully. It was measured against 1,000 moral scales. At the same time, the photograph with the hotel timestamp existed. There was no ethical gray zone in refusing to act because the truth was inconvenient. I had already experienced the cost of staying silent, the miscarriage, the nights alone in the hospital with the white ceiling and a body that had failed me in ways I never expected. I thought, with a bitterness that surprised me, that the world had not made room for my grief. My grief had been politely folded into the margins of his life while he sought solace elsewhere. That was intolerable. Once you decide to act, small practicalities take over. I talked to a counselor, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, because I needed someone to hold the raw edges of what I was about to do. Her office smelled like lemon oil, and she had a voice like a bell. You can pursue accountability and still be humane, she said. You can also plan for your safety. Control what you can and let the rest dissolve. She reminded me that revenge could become a poison if we let it feed us. Revenge is a story, she said, and you can choose a different ending. There were nights I did not sleep, staring at the ceiling with a list of possible outcomes.
There were nights we ate in silence, and the dog looked from one to the other with the bored mediation of a creature who doesn't understand the past. Children folded into blankets and believed, without cynicism, that the world was stable. I kept faith with that for their sake. That's what a mother does. She becomes an economy of small compromises. Sam came back with an additional piece of information that turned the plan toward the place I wanted it to go. Victoria had posted, on a private social channel with a limited audience, a picture that suggested an engagement. The language in the comments, "Can't wait to meet your family," hinted would-be introductions soon. In one comment, someone had asked, "Is Alex joining us for Sunday?" with a smiley face. The post had reached beyond the closed circle, and with it an opening appeared. If Alex did not know, if he was indeed honest and good, then he deserved the truth. And if Victoria was operating in a way that contravened her professional responsibilities, then the complaint we filed would be not just revenge, but a necessary action. I reached out to Alex. It should be said plainly, I did not approach him with malice. I drafted a message that felt like glass between my teeth. Careful, measured. I explained vaguely at first that there were matters about his fiancée that he might want to know. He replied with a mixture of confusion and concern, and asked to speak on the phone. I told him we could meet in person. When he arrived at the cafe, he looked tired in the way surgeons do, frayed at the edges by long hours, but steady-eyed. He had the kind of smile that is small and cautious. He wore a cardigan that made him look like someone who built forts in backyards for his cousins. He listened. At the time, I rehearsed what to say. Instead, I found my words tumbling out unevenly. I told him the truth, as much as we had verified. I watched his face go through stages: bewilderment, disbelief, then a quiet, horror-filled acceptance. He asked about the hospital photograph, and when I showed it, he shoved his hands into his pockets and breathed in a way that suggested a child trying to hold in a sob. "I had no idea," he said. "I thought she loved me." He said that last line like a plea I couldn't quite answer, and in that plea was a world of pity I had not expected. In the weeks after, Alex and I became unlikely allies. He did not want spectacle either. He wanted the truth. He asked what I wanted to do, and I told him, with more honesty than I imagined I would ever have, that I wanted them to be seen. Not publicly, I clarified. Not to harm the children or to humiliate, just to show the reality. He nodded, and in that nod I heard the exact mixture of grief and relief I had felt myself. The plan took shape slowly, because plans always do when they have to avoid being cruel. We consulted Vivian about the legal implications of a public confrontation.
Vivian was clear. There are safer routes, more private routes, ways to achieve separation without spectacle. But she also recognized leverage. If you want accountability, she said, you will have to be prepared for the blowback. She warned that public actions could affect custody arrangements, divorce settlements, and reputations in ways that might ripple out long after the dinner plates were washed. You are not only pursuing him or her, she said, you're reshaping a network that includes other people's livelihoods. That is when I felt perhaps the sharpest double-edged truth of all. The people who betray us often have networks who will be harmed by our actions. I did not enjoy that knowledge. I sat with it. I let it knot inside me. I decided to change the shape of my desire. I would not pursue spectacle merely for cruelty. I would pursue exposure because I needed the truth to be known, and because these betrayals had consequences that extended beyond private sin. We set the date for the dinner for December 24th. I told Marcus a simple lie, that I had invited an old colleague and her new partner, that we were hosting because Lauren and James were traveling, and Emma and Luke wanted a family dinner. I scheduled the house cleaning, I called the caterer we trusted, and I pushed into place the decor that had once been purely celebratory. The tree was up. I spent an evening stringing lights until my fingers tingled. I set the table with the china we had bought when we were first married, and reckless with hopes. It was almost obscene how lovely it was to make a home feel like a haven while planning to turn it into a stage. Lauren helped in ways that cut the tension she carried. "If you're going to hurt them," she said once, half joking, "make sure you hurt them fairly." She is practical in the way of people who love fiercely. She bought matching napkins, iron tablecloths, and suggested the menu, dishes that were showy but not ostentatious. She also kept me from alone nights where my head circled darkly. Sometimes she would bring over Luke and Emma, and they would fall asleep on the couch like tired little buds, and the smallness of their breathing anchored me. We devised logistics with the cold, efficient clarity of people arranging an exhibition. Alex agreed to come, but insisted on one thing. He did not want me to humiliate Victoria. "I want to know," he said, "but I don't want you to be cruel." His insistence mattered because it kept the plan tethered. I had to keep telling myself the reason for the exposure: truth, accountability, the end of falsehood. I told him I would not let it become a show. Vivian prepared some documents that I would keep on hand: copies of the evidence, a draft complaint for the board, and, important, papers that would begin the legal process if Marcus tried to deny the claim or retaliate. "We need to think of every angle," she warned, and I understood this meant not preparing for malice, but for protection. There were practical conversations about safety, about immediate steps if Marcus became volatile. We made lists of phone numbers: Vivian's office, the number for Sam, Dr. Elena. Planning felt less like malice and more like basic survival. I did not tell Marcus the whole truth. I told him that the ex he referred to, Victoria, would be at dinner because he had agreed to be gracious and because Alex and his partner had accepted the invitation. He shrugged, pinning his coat to the rack. He remained a man who thought he could moderate other people's discomfort with a glass of wine and a joke. I watched him from the kitchen doorway as he kissed the kids goodnight. It was a small, domestic image, and it made the plan feel bleedingly real. The nights before the dinner were a study in restraint. I arranged flowers, I reheated sauces, and practiced small conversational openings I could deploy without sounding false. I polished the knife blocks. I laid out the divorce papers in a drawer, not yet to be served, but close enough that the feeling of their presence had settled into the wood. That detail, papers in a drawer, was an anchor, for control, for contingency, for the possibility that I might not be able to bear a public scene, that I might crumble and hand the whole moment over to mercy. On the eve before, I sat by the tree and wrapped presents I had bought for Luke and Emma,
thinking of how far we had walked from the early days when our biggest decision had been which road to take for a weekend drive. The house felt too large and too small at once. Large because of the space betrayal had opened, small because the love we had cultivated made the same rooms feel dense with memory. I thought about revenge constantly in those days, as if it were a tool I could pick up and set down. Revenge is a seductive idea because it promises a neat equilibrium, harm returned for harm done. But the more I moved toward the moment, the more I felt that revenge, if it was to be anything, had to be transformed into a demand for truth. I began to tell myself that there are different kinds of exposure, some that are meant to destroy, others that are meant to stop harm. My plan, as I rehearsed it in the hush between the tree lights and the kitchen hum, was to do the latter. There is a specific kind of calm that comes before a storm. It is not peace, it is a focused readiness. I found it the night before, in a small domestic ritual. I made a tray of tea, I arranged the cutlery like a tender promise, and I laid out my dress on the bed. It was not flamboyant. I wanted to look the way you look when you are claiming a life, composed, a little luminous, not theatrical. I thought of the way eyes pin small, cruel details, how people will remember not the logic but the image. If I was to stage a moment, I wanted that image to be true to what had happened. Sleep came in small, shallow waves. At 3 a.m., I woke and walked to the kitchen.
The house was a soft architectural hush, lights blinking like distant stars from the street. I opened the drawer where the folder sat. Sam's notes, printed messages, Vivian's preliminary notes, and I ran my finger along the edge of the paper as if sensing the future by touch. The phone vibrated in the living room with a message from Alex. I can come earlier if it helps. I typed back, not yet. Then I sat at the table and felt how a life to be remade by one night. On Christmas Eve morning, the air outside had that particular winter clarity, the kind that makes colors sharper. I walked the dog and felt the cold like a tonic. I thought about the ethics board Vivian had suggested we contact if necessary. I thought about the children of people involved. I thought about everything that could go wrong. There was 1,000 small anxieties. Marcus's temper, Victoria's potential reactions, Alex's fragile acceptance. But the overriding current was this. After months of being invisible in my own house, I was determined to be seen. There is an unromantic part of fury that I rarely see in stories, the logistics. The phone calls to the caterer to confirm roast temperatures, to the florist to ensure the centerpiece would not be too tall. I moved through carpenter tasks as if arranging the room for a final scene that would decide a new act of my life. I pressed napkins in a particular fold, remembering the way Marcus once complimented my attention to detail, as if it were a virtue peculiar to our marriage. And then, midway through the afternoon, Marcus said those 3 words in the doorway, as if he were delivering the day's weather report. My ex is coming to dinner. I placed a tray down with the gentle gravity of someone who had spent months preparing for a single breath. He looked relieved, as if his confession had been a small administrative note in his calendar. He did not look frightened. He had no idea the machinery we had set in motion. I smiled, and it held. The smile was not empty. It was the final calculation of all the months of grief, the evidence, the counsel, and the moral sorting. It was, in a way, the first pure, unambiguous thing I had done for myself in a very long time. If you love true life confessions like this, hit subscribe. More stories, more honesty, come weekly. The house filled with a common holiday noise as people began to arrive. Lauren arrived first with 2 pies, cheeks flushed from the cold. She hugged me as if we had been through this 1,000 times already. And then, like someone checking a weapon before battle, she asked, "Everything ready?" I gave her a tight affirmative nod. James arrived with extra chairs. Sam came, inconspicuously dressed, and took a corner as if waiting for a play to begin. Vivian's assistant called to confirm she would stop by later in case things escalated and needed immediate legal action.
Alex texted that he was 15 minutes out, his hands likely empty, not knowing how much of the evening he was about to carry into the future. The table looked comforting and obscene at the same time. Polished silver, the amber glow of candlelight, laughter bouncing off walls that had held so many smaller, secret memories. Luke and Emma danced around us, unaware, their little hands sticky with sugar. The dog lay flat and placid as a sunspot. I set the gravy boat, the small silver one that had been a family heirloom, near the centerpiece. It was a ridiculous thought, but I wanted something that would feel like an anchor to the ordinary. I had thought, once in a moment of gallows humor, about placing a ring inside it, but I did not. The ring would have been such a theatrical gesture that I did not trust myself to keep its meaning from swelling into spectacle. Instead, I left it empty, polished and gleaming, as if to signal the possibility of something clean. Conversations meandered in the living room, catch-ups, surface politeness, the kind of murmured intimacy that makes a house feel alive. Marcus was in his element, telling a story about a work conference, laughing at a joke that isn't funny, thinking only of how to manage appearances. He believed in that moment that the evening was merely a social nicety. No one knew how tightly the strings were pulled. No one knew that a few hours from then, the living room would be transformed into a quiet theater of truth. And in that ignorance lay the power of what we had planned, not the spectacle of public humiliation, but the hard, honest light of exposure. I moved through the room like a conductor, checking cues without letting on. I set down a tray of hors d'oeuvres and brushed crumbs away under the table, like someone erasing a line you were about to cross. I practiced small kindnesses that felt like camouflage, offering a refill of wine to Marcus, asking Alex about his day, asking about the kids' school performances. Each question was a small, ordinary thing, a way to keep the fabric of the evening gentle enough that the eventual shift would be tolerable for the children. That's what I had promised myself. Accountability, yes, but not cruelty. When Alex arrived, he stepped in the doorway, carrying a simple bouquet of winter greens, his face composed but hollowly bright, more weary than pleased to be there. He looked like a man who had already grieved some loss in the last few weeks and was not sure how to carry it into a family environment. Our eyes met for a second, and in that second I felt the world contract. He offered a cautious hello, and then took a seat at the other end of the couch where Sam had stationed himself. I remember the way Marcus checked in, so careless. "Alex, great to see you." He pulled out a chair as if he were arranging the universe to his liking. Victoria arrived later, apologetic for being a few minutes late, a smile that could have been politeness or something practiced.
She was carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a dress that made the lights catch at the collarbone. I remember how, when she hugged me, it felt oddly warm and professional. There was a distance to it that made my skin prickle. Dinner began like any other holiday. Small clinks of glassware, the soft murmur of conversation, Luke dropping mashed potato on the rug. The children giggled. The sound of a laugh rose like birds. I tried to anchor myself in the ordinary for their sake. The plan was still a plan, and yet the edges were softer now that faces were around the table. I kept my voice level, keeping conversations moving, asking about Alex's residency, listening to stories about Marcus's oddball coworkers. I watched Victoria as someone might watch a painting whose brushstrokes they had not expected. At times, she looked like a woman who forgot to be guard dog vigilant about the life she had crafted. At times, she looked like a person who was doing the easiest thing she had learned, smile and say the right thing. The evening wore on. Candlelight made everyone's skin an amber shade. I felt a weight pressing behind my sternum and tried to fold it into breath. I thought of Dr. Elena's words, "Control what you can, let the rest dissolve," and I let them settle for a moment like a benediction. I excused myself to the kitchen on the pretense of clearing plates. I moved slow enough that no one thought anything unusual, and when I reached the pocket of my dress, I felt the paper nestled there. The next step, not yet to be taken, a reserve force. The folder in the drawer waited. Alex texted, "Ready?" And I typed back, 1 minute. The house hummed with the low, soft noises of family life. Outside, the world was quiet, Christmas lulled, the pavement glistening from an earlier rain. Inside, I felt at once small and enormous. Small in the sense that we are all tiny creatures bound to the fortunes of others. Enormous in that for once my decisions had the weight of meaning. I straightened my skirt, smoothed the tablecloth, and took a breath that did not belong wholly to me. The moment of truth had not yet arrived. People still laughed and asked about the dessert. The candle flames trembled as if anxious, and in that tremor I could feel the outcome of months of work pressing toward a single point. I stepped into the living room again, carrying a tray, and for a breath everything was ordinary. Marcus looked up and smiled in that way that has always been part charm, part avoidance. Victoria laughed at something Alex said, small, polite, incredulous. The kids ran their fingers through the cranberry sauce. The moment balanced like a scale. And then a hand touched my shoulder. It was Lauren, her face a pale constellation of nerves and resolve.
Her whisper was close to my ear, a private bolt of steel. Now. My chest tightened. This is where the path forks, where the months of evidence and counsel and quiet work meet the human face of consequence.
The rest of the night was a blade's length away, and I could already feel how sudden everything would feel when it tipped. I adjusted my smile. He had no idea what was coming. Lauren's whisper landed like a match struck against the dry wood of everything that had been waiting to catch fire. Now, her hand was steady on my shoulder. I remembered, in a flash, being small and 7 years old and holding my sister's hand through a dentist clinic because the world of adults still felt dangerous, and she was the map. Now she was that map again. Alex moved first, and he moved like someone who had finally been given permission to be honest. He stood up slowly, as if the motion itself required calibration, and as he did, the room stilled in the odd, immediate way that happens when everyone understands something is about to change. For a moment, there was only the rustle of napkins and the soft clink of a fork against a plate. Marcus smiled at him without noticing the shift. Victoria continued telling a story about a holiday recipe, as if the world she was building on top of our family could withstand the small intrusion of truth. Alex said nothing aggressive. He simply cleared his throat, held his phone up where everyone could see, and spoke in a voice that was both steadier and smaller than I expected. "Victoria, do you have a minute?" It was neutral, almost careful, the way someone might ask to step aside for something private. She blinked, and for half a second I saw the precise, cultivated composure she wore like perfume. Then something in her face went taut. She began. Alex did not wait for her to finish the rehearsed reply. He tapped the screen, and the room shifted into a different light. The blue of a phone screen, the flat, uncompromising clarity of text. He read aloud, quietly at first, then with a hardness that made my teeth ache to hear. The messages were not described in explicit detail. They were the outline of a reality no one in that room wanted to live in. He read a sentence that referenced dates, October 12th. He read a line that mentioned a time, and when he said hospital, the dog lifted its head, and the noise of the room dropped another notch. I felt the air thicken, like honey poured over a flame. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish's. Victoria's smile was gone. Her hands went to the wine bottle as if to steady herself. She looked at Marcus as if for an anchor and found nothing. For the first time all evening, he looked small, less the practiced charmer and more the man who had not been seen. "You can't," Marcus started, the words falling apart. He flung out a hand in a gesture that was supposed to make everything fine again, the old reflex of plausible deniability. "This is manipulated. These are—" Sam, who had been sitting near the bookshelf and who had blended so well into the family's presence that the kids had briefly considered him an uncle, rose then. He did not push.
He simply reached into a jacket pocket and set down a small sheaf of printed pages on the coffee table, hotel receipts, reservations, photographs that had been printed in a clean, unflinching quality. There was a hush as paper met wood. Where the phone's voice had been ephemeral, Sam's documents had weight. Vivian appeared in the doorway not long after, not theatrical, but exact. She had come on pretext of being nearby in case, and she stepped into the room with a legal calm that felt like a steel door sliding closed. She did not raise her voice. She did not act as if the room were a courtroom. She simply took in the papers, read them, and moved to stand beside me. I could see then that the plan we had spent months composing was no longer an abstraction. It was a living public fact. The reasons we had done this, truth, accountability, protection, seemed thin and massive at the same time. I watched Alex's face as he looked at Victoria, and then at Marcus, and then back at the evidence like someone closing a loop. There was such a human ache to his expression that I was ashamed for a moment of the part of me that had rehearsed grand lines. This was not theater for him. This was the dismantling of a life he had constructed with care. "Is this true?" Alex asked, not accusatory, but broken. Victoria's first response was to laugh, a short, strained sound that did not find its home. "I never meant—" she started, and then stopped, a woman making room for a story she could no longer keep believing. "I have messages," Alex said. "Pictures." His voice broke once. I don't understand how you could—" Marcus finally found a voice, and it was not the smooth explanation I had heard in the years before. It was ragged.
It doesn't mean what it looks like. He tried the old word, the one he always used when apologizing in a language I had long ago learned to distrust. It was complicated. But what is complicated about choosing secrecy over your marriage night after night? What vocabulary holds the cruelty of being absent when your household is breaking? There was a moment of what I can only describe now as public reconfiguration. People in the room shifted, the kids looked confused. Someone from the neighborhood, an aunt, a friend, waited in the hallway as if unsure whether to enter. Alex's hands trembled as he put his phone down. The only sound was a child's small question. Why is Auntie Victoria crying? And then Lauren, who had stayed on the edges of everything, answered for us. Because sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices. It was then I understood that the choice we had made, to bring truth into the center of my home, was not a spectacle for the sake of cruelty. It was a necessary act of unbinding. People cannot make decisions to stay or leave without knowledge. If Victoria had been living a life of duplicity, then a line had to be drawn. I stood up.
The divorce papers were heavier in my hands than the months of planning had suggested. Paperweight is not literal. It is the sense that paper can finally tell what the heart would not. I walked to the table and set them down in front of Marcus. I did not theatrically fling them across the table. I placed them with the same careful, exact manner I had used to fold napkins earlier. The papers had his name at the top and mine below. They were not the final word on anything legal. Vivian had been careful about that. But they were the first formal step. They were a boundary. "This is what I've chosen," I said, and my voice was even. "I am filing for divorce." Marcus's face went through a few faces in quick succession. Confusion, anger, incredulity. "You're doing this now?" He laughed, but the laugh had no warmth. "On Christmas Eve?" "Yes," I said. "Tonight." There was no venom in the tone, only a precise, exhausted definitiveness. The room tilted in a direction I had rehearsed like a single chord over and over in my head. The children were slowly shepherded out by James and Lauren, who had learned the art of making separate rooms for the not-for-kids moments. I guided Emma to the sofa and told her we would read a story later. Luke asked if Santa would still come. I hugged them both and felt that fierce, terrible warmth that is the engine of a parent's life, protecting the small constants while the adult world rearranged itself. Attempts at excuse followed. Marcus tried explanations that fell like wet leaves. Victoria tried to cry, then to apologize. Alex stepped forward, placed his palm on the table, and said with a clarity that surprised us all, "I want to know the truth. I want to know everything before I make any choice about my life." There was no dramatic denunciation. There was a man trying to build the facts of his future on something other than a performance. As people slowly drifted into the living room to witness, neighbors, a cousin, Vivian with a notebook in hand, Marcus finally said what I think he had been afraid to say aloud for months. "I didn't expect this to go public. I didn't expect any of this." The smallness of his words shaped the moment. He had, in his own worldview, been banking on the private architecture of forgiveness and forgetting. He had built a life assuming he could put all the messy things behind him and keep the best of the family shining. The practicalities moved then. Vivian gently coached me to make sure my children were in safe, loving hands for the night and arranged for a temporary separation plan that would be executed the next morning, where each of us would sleep that night and who would stay in the home if that was safe. Sam, with the quiet humility of someone used to being the bearer of bad facts, handed over copies of his report to Vivian. Those documents would be part of the dossier she would use in the coming days, but in that moment they felt like shards of a life rearranged. Victoria stood up. She gathered her coat with trembling hands, her face an unreadable mixture of shame and fury. I had expected a different exit, screaming, pleading, some attempt at blame-shifting, but she padded toward the door almost mechanically. "I need to go," she said, voice small, and then she was gone into the night. Later, we learned she had left with a therapist's briefcase and one of the qualifications that had once been the map of her life. Marcus lingered. For a moment, he looked at the children, at the plates, at the life we had made, and then he rose and left as if pulled by a line somewhere outside the house. The door clicked shut behind him like the finality of a stage that had been cleared. He did not fight. He did not scream. He simply collected himself and the version of a life he still wished to believe in and walked away. After they left, the room felt both enormous and vacuous. I collapsed into one of Lauren's arms on a couch that had been a place of so many small confidences. My body, which had spent months in the climate of careful endurance, finally gave up. I sobbed in a way that was not cinematic, a small, relentless unthreading. Lauren held me. Sam sat on the edge of the coffee table, his hands steepled. Vivian whispered what needed doing now. Temporary orders, protective measures, securing documents. Alex remained, not as a spectacle, but as a presence with a broken, honest face. He came over, sat beside me, and put his hand lightly on my knee. There were no grand speeches. There was only the small grace between two people who had been wounded by the same hand. In the weeks that followed, the world reorganized itself into meetings and papers and the strange, unromantic rituals of legal life. Vivian moved with the efficiency of someone who had seen this before. She filed initial paperwork and advised on what would protect our children's routines while proceedings occurred. We met with a mediator and then with the judge's clerk. Sam delivered additional evidence he had lawfully obtained. He never spoke in dramatic terms about how he got it. When I asked him about lines he had crossed, he was blunt. "I work within the law," he said. "Anything else would have been your right to consider or not." He was careful with his phrases and with mine. There were things that happened almost immediately. Marcus moved out within days. We arranged who would keep which things and how the children would split their time. It was not pleasant, but it was necessary. I stayed in the house for a while because I could not imagine the alternate, and because Vivian insisted it would be best for continuity. There were awkward, tense mornings where coffee cups sat like traps, and the mail slid under doors with the neutral indifference of bureaucracy. Vivian did the thing she insisted on. She asked for an ethics review into Victoria's conduct. I remember signing forms in her office, my signature a trembling line that also felt like a claim.
The complaint asked questions. Had there been a breach of professional boundaries? Did her behavior while seeing clients suggest a conflict of interest? Were there confidentiality lapses? These were heavy words that rolled through systems I barely understood, but the principle resonated. Professionals who owe people the duty of trust must be held to account when that trust is broken, especially if others were harmed in the process. A few months later, there was a letter. The professional board had reviewed our complaint and through their process of investigation took disciplinary action. According to the board's published findings and the complaint we had submitted, Victoria's license was temporarily suspended as part of an administrative measure pending a full hearing. I choose my words carefully. I describe the outcome as it was communicated to me, as a result of formal procedures. I cannot promise the same will happen in other circumstances. Legal and administrative processes are varied, contextual, and laden with nuance. All I can say is that for me, the complaint resulted in a formal investigation and a loss of the professional standing she had once used as a shield. Marcus's professional life, meanwhile, fractured in the way that private revelations sometimes do. An internal audit at his firm, triggered in part by the disclosures we made about marital spending tied to the affair, raised questions about his spending and conduct. He eventually resigned from his position. I will not say this was punishment or consequence in any deterministic way. Corporations make decisions for complex reasons. But there was a practical unraveling of the life we had woven together. The legal separation that Vivian negotiated secured me the house, an outcome we had argued for based on the children's needs and what I could realistically manage. The settlement was not theatrical. It was a series of careful negotiations about bills and assets and custody, and what would be best for the children and for my own survival. Emotionally, the months were not dramatic leaps so much as a slow unfreezing. I started therapy with Dr. Elena in earnest. Some sessions were raw and terrible. Others were small victories. "Grief is not a timeline," she said one afternoon, her voice even and kind as she handed me a box of tissues. "It's an accessory. You wear it in some rooms and not in others. You will snap it on when you need it and take it off when you can." That image, grief as an accessory, was not diminishing. It was practical. It told me that grief could be managed and lived with rather than being a condemnation. There were unexpected kindnesses. Friends who had been peripheral sat down with us. Strangers reached out with emails and messages. Women telling me their own stories of betrayal, of slow awakenings, of the best and worst parts of the legal world. Alex and I kept in touch. He did not become a boyfriend or a savior.
He became what he had been from the beginning, a man who had been deceived and who, like me, needed to rebuild. We shared meals, then coffee, then an easier ease. There was a quiet recognition between us. We had both been caught in someone else's story and were now choosing new plots. I lost things in ways that mattered. There were quiet moments when I missed Marcus, not the man who lied, but the man I had once loved for small, real reasons. I missed the safety of shared bills, the strange intimacy of someone who knows your coffee order without being asked.
But I also found other things, like the fierce independence of being able to make choices without triangulation, the surprising clarity of being the author of my own schedule, the mornings where the house smelled like my coffee and not the residue of avoidance. My professional life shifted as well. The design work that had always been a refuge for me, an economy of beauty and order, began to swell into something larger. I took to painting again in small bursts. I painted restless things that looked like memory, and then sold the pieces at a local gallery. Slowly, clients came who wanted more than staging. They wanted the narrative work I did, the ability to shape a space that told a story of healing rather than hiding. I took a business course, then rented a small studio, then hired an assistant. The studio had one wall painted an impossible teal that made people breathe when they walked into the door. We called the agency a week before our first client meeting, voted on a name, and I watched the small things line up: a logo, a website, a first contract. I wrote at night. It began as a confession, a private string of sentences in the margins of a legal folder. Then lines expanded, and one poem gathered another, and a shape took hold, a memoir about the months that unspooled my life. I called it My Beautiful Vengeance, not as a boast, but as an exploration of what vengeance meant to me, the way it had started as a bitter heat and had been tempered into a demand for truth and safety. The writing was messy, and there were days I hurled the pages into a corner and felt I could not possibly translate those years without betraying the rawness. But I kept at it, with Dr. Elena's quiet encouragement and Lauren's editorial ruthlessness. When the book found a publisher, after a long, hope-filled query season, I felt like someone who had been given permission to speak publicly about private wounds. The memoir did not revel in the misery. It tried to analyze why I had been silent for so long, why I had been willing to make allowances, how the ordinary patterns of marriage can become slow, insidious eroders. It also told the practicalities: therapy, counsel, the slow architecture of a life rebuilt. I included a chapter on the ethics complaint, careful to present it as a legal process rather than a moral instrument I used for revenge.
I wanted readers to see the human cost on all sides, while still acknowledging that some forms of accountability are necessary. The book did well beyond my expectations. It reached people who sent me letters, handwritten notes from women who had been left on kitchen floors like me, men who described witnessing the erosion of their marriages and seeking help, therapists who wrote about how the profession must wrestle with its own blind spots. Some of the reception felt redemptive. Some of it was merciless. There were op-eds and a few television interviews where I was asked about the morality of my choices. I spoke then as I had in the months of evidence gathering, honesty without moralizing. I said that I regretted the pain we had caused, but that I would not erase the need I had felt to be seen and protected. I spoke about grief, about the miscarriage, about the fact that sometimes the world saves us by forcing a crack in the walls we've made. There was a curious thing about public attention. It turned private mistakes into a kind of communal mirror. Some people loved me, others hated me. The parish of judgment exploded across comment sections and message boards. I learned to scroll with the same clinical distance I had used when printing out messages. It was, all at once, freeing and strange to have my life unpacked into pixels. In the quieter months, the children returned to small rhythms. School events regained their ordinary importance. Emma started piano. Luke found a new friend at soccer who liked the same odd brand of sticker collecting. We took trips to local parks, and sometimes, rarely, we would go to the beach and stand in the cold Atlantic wind as if to shake off the salt of the old days. Those outings were not snapshots of healed bliss, but of work. Parenting is a craft of showing up while everything within you rearranges. I kept seeing Alex around town. He was steady in a way I had not known before. He volunteered at the children's hospital, as he'd always done, and sometimes he would show up at my studio with coffee at dawn, and we would talk about a client or a chapter in my book. Friendship, in the slow aftermath, felt like the rarest honesty, building something without maps, with only a mutual understanding that both of us had been hurt by the same deceit. I still have nights where grief takes me in the way a tide takes a shore, without warning and with force. I still occasionally stand by the kitchen window and think about what might have been if I had said something earlier, if I had been braver before the miscarriage or more suspicious of the tiny margins where secrecy grows. Those are the hard, private reckonings that have no moral payoff. They are merely the way life is compounded by choices. But there is also a stubborn, simple joy. I remember the day my design agency took on a nonprofit that helped women transition after divorce. I found myself in a board meeting explaining how spaces could help people feel safe.
There is meaning in that work that I did not expect to know,
There is laughter again, often, small, quick, and slightly surprised at its presence. And the book, my strange accidental book, led to conversation. I spoke at women's groups, panels, and even a small conference on ethics in therapy. People would come up afterward with their own stories. Some of them said, quietly, "I didn't know where to turn." Others said, "Thank you for reminding me I could leave." Each of those notes was a kind of repayment, not for vindication, but for the sense that my story had given another person a small instrument of clarity. Over the years, I have tried to be careful about how I name things. I do not claim that exposure will always heal. Sometimes it bruises further. I do not advise spectacle as a first resort. I tell people, when they ask, about the slow, imperfect process of safety plans, legal counsel, therapy, because secrecy and shame are not resolved by one dramatic night alone. I also tell them that being seen matters, being witnessed by someone who will not let your pain be turned into a private misdemeanor of the soul. If there's a lesson I keep returning to, it is this. Justice and revenge can look similar at a glance, but they are different forces. Revenge wants the other to fall. Justice wants harm to stop and the wounded to be protected. My plan had at its root a quest for the latter. Did I feel vindicated when Victoria's license was suspended and Marcus left his job? In moments, yes, but those victories were small, brittle things compared to the work of rebuilding trust with my own heart and with my children. They did not erase the ache of the miscarriage or the nights I woke up to the absence of the person I'd once planned to grow old with. What they did do was make it possible for me to move forward on my own terms. There is also the matter of cost. The cost was not only emotional. There were financial expenses, legal fees, therapy, the slow drip of rebuilding a business. There was the social cost, friends who chose sides, extended family who grew distant. Those are the taxes that life levies when you decide to remap your story. They are not small, but they are survivable. Months turned into a year. The house that had once been the locus of secrets slipped into a new normal. A wall painted teal, now holding children's artwork, a mantel with photos of birthdays, a corner with a studio light and a canvas half finished. I learned to enjoy small domesticities again, a well-made bed, the way coffee smells at dawn, the softness of a child's goodnight. These were practical pleasures, not grand sweeping joys. They were the candies that sustain you in the quiet. I still think of Marcus sometimes. I do not hate him as a person. Hatred is a heavy dress to wear daily. But I do not trust him in the ways that matter. My life no longer runs along the path it once did with him at its side. That too is a kind of grief.
In the end, I decided to try on a new phrase instead of revenge or victory: thriving. Thriving is not a one-time scream of success. It is the ongoing accumulation of small choices made toward life. It is the days the children laugh without the thick sound of tension in the room. It is the emails from readers who say my book made them leave an abusive situation. It is the first contract for the agency that allowed me to hire someone whose work I respected and pay them fairly. Years later, I was invited to speak at a small college. A woman in the audience stood up at the end, hands shaking with a folded note, and read me a letter about her own quiet months of gathering evidence and seeking counsel. She said, "Your story gave me a shape for my anger and a path for my grief." I sat on that stage and thought about the hotel photo with its ugly timestamp, the coffee cups at a kitchen table, the way a smile can be a weapon as well as a mask. The recognition that my story could act as a map for another person, could help them see and choose, felt like the opposite of spectacle. It felt redemptive. If I'm honest, there are still nights when I stand by the tree and feel the old, thin film of the trail. The holidays are not uncomplicated. They never will be again in quite the same way. But the house now holds memories that are not only of loss. It contains new paintings, new inside jokes, and the laughter of children who know they are loved in straightforward, tangible ways. On one of the most ordinary evenings this past winter, Alex and I walked past the church where we had once considered small rites and not yet decided on anything. We didn't speak of the past much. There was no need. He squeezed my hand and we both smiled like people who had survived and were now learning to inhabit a world free of secrecy. It is not romanticized. It is work. It is making. So when I think back to that Christmas Eve, to Marcus standing in the doorway and saying, "My ex is coming to dinner," I do not see the man he once pretended to be. I remember instead a woman who, in the middle of her greatest loss,
decided she would not be invisible. I remember a table that had been both a stage and a sanctuary, and a night when truth was chosen over silence. He had no idea what came next, and in that not knowing lay the possibility for everything I could become. In place of a final act of humiliation, I chose a life of honest accountability, and then I chose to live it. The cost was real. The repair has been slow. But the thing that felt most like revenge at first, the public reveal, has in time transmuted into a quiet insistence that my life would not be defined by someone else's secrecy. If this story resonated with you, if you have a similar experience or a question, leave a comment below and share your voice. You're not alone. And if you want to hear more true life confessions and honest recoveries, consider subscribing.